So today's deep dive takes us into some pretty fascinating and rather unique writing, I would say. We're looking at excerpts from chapter 63, Achieving Greatness.
Okay.
Within the Built for God, BFG movement handbook. Now, this movement describes their handbook as a Christian edition of the Tao Te Ching. And this chapter in particular is really aiming to kind of reframe the gospel through what they call like a new expression of God's love to restore the truth.
Okay, a Christian lens on the Tao Te Ching. That's not something you see every day. For this deep dive, then, our goal is to really unpack these principles of achieving greatness as presented in this chapter. We want to get to the heart of their core ideas and then also see how they connect with these broader themes of faith. And then crucially, I think, how do these ideas translate into action in our lives?
How do we actually live this out?
Exactly. Are you ready?
I'm ready. Let's do it. So right off the bat, the chapter opens with a pretty intriguing set of lines. Act with stillness, work without effort, taste without engrossing. How do we put this into practice?
Approaching life with a sense of inner peace and a trust in God's control.
Okay.
And they point us to that familiar verse, Psalm 46.10, be still and know that I am God. So when we consider that idea of acting with stillness, what different angles come to mind for you?
Well, what's so interesting is that this idea of stillness, it's really present in a lot of tradition. We live in such a fast-paced world. And this idea of cultivating an inner calm and really having that be the foundation of your actions. It's not something that's just unique to this text. It's something that we see again and again. I think it's about intentionality, like slowing down our reactions and maybe seeking, a deeper sense of centeredness before we just go, go, go. And I think that the handbook's emphasis on trusting in God's control, it really provides a specific, theological grounding for this stillness, within a Christian context.
Right, because it does make you think. I mean, how often do we equate, productivity with constant motion?
All the time, yeah.
Yeah, and then they go on and they introduce this next idea of work without effort, which is really intriguing, but I really wonder about how it's applied. What does this look like practically? And the way that the handbook explains this is, it's really about partnering with God. It's about allowing His power to work through us rather than just relying on our own. And they give us a couple of references here, John 14.10, Matthew 11.28. And those passages are, about Jesus saying, the works that I do are not mine, but the Father's. And, that whole idea of come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest.
Beautiful image.
So, how might this idea then of effortless work look in our day-to-day lives?
If we take a step back, I think this idea of effortless work, it really touches on the larger concept of grace within the Christian faith. We're not meant to carry the whole burden on our own. And, the handbook focuses on surrendering to God's will. And it offers, I think, a really specific way of understanding that concept. And I think it's really important to say here, it's not about a lack of action. It's about maybe a shift in the motivation.
Where it's coming from. Yeah.
And reliance. Yeah, so imagine, approaching a difficult project, not with that sense of frantic energy.
Right.
But with a sense of purpose that's aligned with your belief and trusting that you're not alone in it.
Right. You're not doing it all on your own.
Exactly.
It's not all on your shoulders. That makes a lot of sense. So it's almost like working from a place of faith, not for it.
That's a really beautiful way of putting it.
Then they go on and they introduce this third piece, which is taste without engrossing, which it kind of brings in this whole idea of balance and detachment. And the example the handbook uses is, enjoying those blessings that we've received, but without becoming addicted to them. And they give us a few scriptures here, Luke 18.22, 1 Corinthians 7.2931, and 1 John 2.15. It's about appreciating what we have, but without letting it, rule us.
Yeah.
Control us.
It's not becoming our master.
Exactly.
Yeah, I think taste without engrossing, it speaks to a mindful engagement with the world. And I think it raises a really important question for you listening. Where might there be areas in your life where enjoyment has maybe tipped over into something that consumes you? Could a bit of detachment actually bring a renewed sense of appreciation for the things that you enjoy?
Yeah, it makes you think. The handbook then organizes these principles under this renewal framework that they have with mindset, aim, and practice sections. So for act with stillness, the aim is aim for inner stillness, and the practice is practice stillness in action. highlighting that whole idea of this is something that you cultivate, It's an ongoing habit.
It's a practice.
Exactly.
Okay.
And then similarly with work without effort, the aim for effortless action, which again is emphasizing that shift in reliance.
Right.
And then the practice focuses on developing that trust in God's strength. So it's a very, structured way of looking at how to take these abstract ideas and really apply them in our lives.
Yeah, I think that structure is key to the BFG movement's approach. It's a pathway for internalizing these concepts, translating them into tangible changes in our behavior and perspective. And the emphasis on practice, I think that's particularly important. It really highlights that these aren't just ideas to think about,
right,
but principles to actively integrate into your life, live out.
Exactly.
And then the chapter shifts to another, I think, core theme with the lines, make great in what is small, make abundant in what is few, reward hatred with kindness, achieve greatness in small things. And I think here there's a real emphasis on the significance of the seemingly insignificant, the little things.
The small things, the everyday things.
Exactly.
Yeah, I think that idea of making great in the small, it has deep roots in a variety of faith traditions. And the Handbook connects it to God's promise to Abraham in Genesis 12:1-2. And that story illustrates how something small really blossoms into something huge through faith.
Right.
And they also reference James 2.5, highlighting that, God often chooses the humble, the lowly, the ones who aren't necessarily seen as, important in the world's eyes. What comes to mind for you when you consider this idea that such profound significance can be found in the ordinary?
Well, I think it's a very encouraging perspective. It reminds us that we don't always need grand gestures to really make a difference.
It's really the intention and the care that we bring to even those, everyday tasks and those little interactions. And then that line, reward hatred with kindness. I mean, that is such a direct reflection of Jesus's teaching in Matthew 5:43-48. It's a challenging principle, though, to live by. Respond to negativity with positivity.
It's a tall order.
It is.
And the Handbook's mindset section, it really explains that it's about reflecting a different kind of power. It's the power of love and forgiveness.
Mm-hmm.
And, that real world application of choosing compassion, when you're faced with animosity, it can have a ripple effect that is way bigger than you can imagine.
Mm-hmm. And they break this down again with, mindset, aim, and practice. So for make great in what is small, the mindset is really about recognizing the value that God places on humble acts, with the practical application being dedicated to every task. No matter how small or insignificant it may seem, the aim is aim for humility in small things. And then the practice is to, practice humility in all things. So again, very consistent in terms of really calling us to live this out.
It's a way of being.
Yeah.
And for that principle of reward hatred with kindness, the mindset is explicitly about reflecting God's love. And the application then becomes responding to that negativity with compassion. The aim is aim for kindness in response to hatred. And the practice is actively choosing kindness in the face of hatred. It's such a direct and action-oriented approach to what is a core ethical teaching.
Yeah. Then the next set of lines introduces these themes of simplicity, trustworthiness, and wisdom. See simplicity in difficult tasks. Achieve greatness in small things. Difficult tasks of the world are handled through the simple tasks. Large tasks of the world are handled through the small tasks. Therefore, the wise do not need to handle large tasks. Yet they still achieve greatness. People who make promises lightly are not trustworthy. People who take everything too lightly encounter more difficulties. Therefore, the wise identify the task as difficult, so they do not encounter difficulties.
There's a lot there about how we approach challenges and commitments.
A lot to unpack. And, this idea of seeing simplicity in difficult tasks, it really resonates with the teaching on faith. I think of Jesus's analogy of the mustard seed in Matthew 17:20, in the Handbook's mindset section. It interprets this as breaking down those overwhelming tasks into smaller steps, more manageable steps.
A really practical strategy for overcoming that sense of being overwhelmed or stuck. What are your thoughts on this connection between simplicity and tackling those really big challenges?
I think it's about mental reframing. Instead of getting paralyzed by, how big a problem is, if you can focus on those immediate actionable steps, that can give you momentum and make this seemingly impossible feel doable.
Yeah.
And I love the warning about making promises lightly.
Proverbs 20.25, Jeremiah 9.4-9, underscoring that importance of integrity in our word.
Yeah.
And commitments. It's about being trustworthy.
And being a person of your word.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And I think that emphasis on trustworthiness is fundamental to strong relationships and just to having, a really reliable character.
And the Handbook's mindset section, it cautions against taking commitments lightly. And, it advocates for a wise approach to identifying like how difficult a task might be, beforehand to avoid complications, thoughtful engagement.
Yeah, don't just say yes to everything.
Exactly.
Yeah. See simplicity in difficult tasks. The aim is aim for simplicity and complexity. And the practice is practice simplicity in complex tasks. So again, it's that same idea of cultivate the mindset and then apply it in the real world. And I think similarly, the principles around trustworthiness, I think they're really aimed at cultivating wisdom and foresight in how we approach our responsibilities.
Exactly. It's about developing a habit of careful consideration, realistic assessment, and that ultimately contributes to a more grounded and trustworthy way of being in the world.
Now, the chapter kind of takes this really interesting turn with a section that they titled Respond. And this is where the focus shifts to really highlighting those shared truths that can be found across different cultures and religious boundaries. Yeah, and they take some of these core principles that we've been discussing, like, make great in what is small and reward hatred with kindness. And they actually point to parallel teachings in Christianity, Islam, Hinduism, and Buddhism.
Look, these fundamental principles, they're popping up all over in these different spiritual traditions. For example, the idea of valuing humility and leadership and service, which aligns with that principle of make great in what is small.
Yeah.
You see it in Matthew 20.26 in Christianity, a variety of hadith in Islam, the Bhagavad Gita in Hinduism, the Dhammapada in Buddhism. It's really compelling to see that, that emphasis coming up again and again.
It's really interesting to see that kind of convergence. And, the principle of reward hatred with kindness also kind of demonstrates this. We see that in Matthew 5.44, Romans 12.21, in Christianity, similar guidance in the Quran, the Bhagavad Gita, and the Dhammapada. And they all underscore that transformative power of love and forgiveness. Even when you're faced with, someone who's against you, who's an enemy. And it really does make you reflect on that kind of universality of some of these ethical teachings.
Absolutely. And the Handbook draws these parallels for see simplicity in difficult tasks as well, linking it to passages in Matthew 19.14 and James 3.17 in Christianity, and Surah Al-Baqarah 2.286 of the Quran, the Bhagavad Gita 12.11, and the Dhammapada verse 1, all emphasizing the importance of a focused and uncluttered mind. And then that idea of making promises and keeping your word. That resonates across traditions as well. From Matthew 5.37 and Luke 16 from Christianity to very similar ideas in the Quran, the Bhagavad Gita 17.15 and the Dhammapada verse 76, highlighting that importance of integrity in our word.
And even this whole idea of work without effort.
Yeah.
I mean, it seems to find resonance across all these different faiths with connections drawn to Matthew 11.28 and Philippians 4.7 in Christianity, the Bhagavad Gita, and a variety of Buddhist teachings on, finding inner peace and acting without attachment. And I think it's so interesting how all these different spiritual paths kind of touch on these very similar aspects of inner cultivation.
It seems like they're trying to say that these are really fundamental truths that go beyond any specific religious doctrine, and it's promoting a message of unity and peace and love. And they even include a quote from St. Thomas Aquinas that says, truth cannot contradict truth, which I think sums up this perspective beautifully, this idea of an underlying harmony across different expressions of faith.
Yeah, that's a good point. So as we start to wrap up this deep dive, I think it's helpful to recap some of those key insights from Chapter 63 of the BFG Handbook. So we've explored, the importance of acting with that inner stillness and a sense of effortless action, that profound impact of finding greatness in those small acts and choosing to respond to, negativity with kindness. And we've also examined the wisdom in approaching challenges with simplicity, how crucial it is to be trustworthy in those commitments that we make and the value in really cultivating inner peace.
And I think perhaps most significantly, we've seen how these principles, while they are framed within a Christian context by the BFG movement, they really do seem to echo across a whole bunch of different faith traditions. It suggests that there's a common ground in our shared human experience and a universality to certain ethical and spiritual truths.
Yeah, that's a really great point. And so as we leave you, the listener, with a final thought to consider, How might you intentionally incorporate just one of these principles? Maybe it's consciously practicing stillness before you react to something, or making a very deliberate effort to find the significance, in a seemingly small or insignificant task. How might doing that begin to kind of change your perspective on what truly matters in your life? Think about how these inner shifts and these seemingly small choices, they can have a ripple effect.
Think about which of these ideas sparked the most interest for you. Maybe it was effortless action. Maybe it was the surprising parallels across different faiths. Take that initial spark, explore it further in your own way. There's always more to discover when we just delve a little deeper.
Well, thanks for joining me for another deep dive.
Always a pleasure.
Until next time.